Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez in Washington, where President Trump and his team are escalating their legal and political fight with Democrats, while seemingly laying the groundwork to invoke a rarely used law from 1807 that gives the president emergency powers to defend the country against a rebellion. It comes as the administration pushes for additional military deployments into Democratic-run cities and tries to paint Democrats as literal insurrectionists. Speaking in the Oval Office today while meeting with the Canadian Prime Minister, President Trump once again refused to rule out invoking the Insurrection Act amid his effort to deploy the National Guard to cities like Portland and Chicago.
Can we talk about Portland for a second? Are you planning to invoke the Insurrection Act? And that would be, a very long-standing law that's been on the books.
Yeah, well, it's been invoked before, as you know. If you look at Chicago, Chicago's a great city where there's a lot of crime. And if the governor can't do the job, we'll do the job. It's all very simple.
The president and his senior advisor, Stephen Miller, have both ramped up their rhetoric around the Insurrection Act. Here's some of what they've said in just the last 24 hours.
These Democrats are like insurrectionists, okay? They're so bad for our country. Their policy is so bad for our country.
If you take a look at what's been going on in Portland, it's been going on for a long time, and that's insurrection. I mean, that's pure insurrection.
Portland's been on fire for years, and not so much saving it. We have to save something else, because I think that's all insurrection. I really think that's really criminal insurrection.
There's an effort to delegitimize the core function of the federal government of enforcing our immigration laws and our sovereignty. It is domestic terrorism. It is insurrection. This is an all-out campaign of insurrection against the sovereignty of the United States, because the Democrat Party and those who are committing violence in this country do not believe in the legitimacy of the sovereign territory of the United States.
Right now, a court order is blocking military deployments to Portland, and a judge in Illinois is considering whether to temporarily block a similar deployment of National Guard troops to Chicago. But pending a ruling, President Trump and his allies appear ready to begin those deployments. It all comes as Attorney General Pam Bondi appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee today, with Democrats accusing the president of using the DOJ as a political weapon against his rivals. The hearing was combative at times, with Bondi repeatedly dodging their questions and criticisms.
Were you consulted by the White House before they deployed National Guard troops to cities in the United States?
I am not going to discuss any internal conversations with the White House.
I was going to ask you if you received advice, instruction, or request from anyone at the White House to direct the department to engage in any investigations, prosecutorial actions, including decisions not to investigate or prosecute anyone.
I'm not going to discuss it.
I'd like to know from you what conversations you've had with President Trump about the indictment of James Comey.
Senator, I am not going to discuss any conversations I have or have not had with the President of the United States.
Did you see that?
And joining me now is our team of reporters. NBC White House reporter Yamiche Alcindor, NBC News Chief Justice and National Affairs Correspondent Kelly O'Donnell, and NBC News Senior Homeland Security Correspondent Julia Ainsley. Thank you all so much for joining me. Yamiche, I want to start with you. What are you hearing behind the scenes? How seriously is the administration considering the Insurrection Act?
It's a good question. We know that the president has brought it up. We know, of course, that top White House advisor Stephen Miller has also brought up using this act, but it's not clear that the president is leaning toward that, though I should tell you in a conversation that I had with the president about a week ago, he brought up the word insurrection, talking about what he saw as happening in Portland without me bringing up the word insurrection. So it tells you that it's sort of in the ethos and on his mind. It will be very interesting to see whether or not he actually leans into that strategy, given the fact that he's now running into these roadblocks with governors saying that they don't want to give their National Guard to the president, and of course with these court battles that he's losing, Gabe.
And Julia, I want to bring you in. What would it mean in practice if the administration were to invoke the Insurrection Act?
Well, look, I mean, the Insurrection Act is there for the United States to be able to protect itself against an insurrection, an uprising from within the interior of the country rather than being attacked from the outside. And so it allows the military to break from this longstanding rule of posa comitatus, which keeps the military from enforcing domestic law. So it would allow the military to go into these cities, throw away those restrictions, and start acting like a military against an insurrection.
What defines an insurrection?
Well, that's a good question, and I've been reading up on that more today, as you might expect. And in fact, actually, it's not that rare. This is actually the longest period in history we've gone without invoking the Insurrection Act. The last time it was invoked was 1992 by George H.W. Bush after the riots and protests that broke out in Los Angeles following the police brutality incident of Rodney King. Insurrection Act was called there so that they could try to enforce more law and order in the city of Los Angeles. Of course, that didn't come without some controversy as well. It was also used during the civil rights movement by Lyndon Johnson to make sure that children could safely go to schools as they were integrating in the South. It's not unheard of, but in this case, I think the reason why we're all talking about it more is how is the White House going to change and kind of redefine what's happening in cities like Chicago and Portland to make it appear as if there's an insurrection without a real clear line about what exactly it is that needs to be crossed for them to do that.
Well, they're certainly testing the limits of executive power. Yamiche, really quickly, how confident is the White House when it comes to these legal cases? Do they just see this as a political winner for them?
Well, Gabe, I'm sure as you're talking to your sources and I'm talking to mine, we both are hearing the same echoes, which is every time the White House loses a legal battle, every time the president is told by a federal judge that he can't do something, the White House looks to the Supreme Court to solve that. And in most cases, and case after case, we've seen the Supreme Court side with the president. Now, of course, the Supreme Court hasn't sided with the president on everything, but the president really does see the Supreme Court in this 6-3 conservative majority, which, of course, he added to during his first term, as a sort of safety net in his mind, as him losing in the lower courts really doesn't mean anything, because he really does believe in most cases he'll be able to win in the Supreme Court. Now, whether or not that means that he'll ultimately win, especially when it comes to trying to federalize the National Guard and send them into these Democratic-run cities, is a big question. But the president continues to really believe that every time he loses, he can just appeal to the Supreme Court and get his way.
And I want to get to Kelly in a minute about the grilling that Attorney General Pam Bondi had on Capitol Hill today. But Julia, before I let you go, she did say today that senior administration officials are heading to Chicago. What do we expect the National Guard troops will be doing in the Windy City?
Well, we understand that some National Guard troops from Texas have already arrived in a suburb of Chicago to begin training. Unless the Insurrection Act is invoked, we would expect that these National Guard men and women would not be able to use weapons, to be able to make arrests, to do anything that really looks like policing, that would still be left to federal agents like ICE and Border Patrol or to local police there. And that really they're there as a deterrent, as a show of force, much like what we saw here in Washington, D.C. this summer.
Right. And speaking with White House officials, they certainly like those images. They want the video to serve as a deterrent of those troops, in their view, swarming some of these Democratic-run cities. Kelly, I want to switch to you. Attorney General Bondi, she was very combative. I know you were watching this hearing earlier. Was she basically testifying for an audience of one?
In many ways, certainly the message that she delivered was intended to reach President Trump, but it also showed that she came in prepared for what she knew would be tough questioning. And so what stood out to me in part is that she was so combative with Senate Democrats that it seemed as if she had an oppo file on a number of them, bringing up some controversies that they have experienced that are sometimes many years old as a way to fight back in conversations. She was also very clear that she didn't want to talk about any private discussions she's had with the White House. There is an argument to be made for that a president deserves to have private counsel. But if you are asked if the president or the White House has discussed with the James Comey indictment with you at any time, there is an answer of no if that were the case. She could have taken that option. Instead, she shut down any discussion of her conversations.
Well, I want to play some more of what Senate Democrats had to say today. Let's listen.
What has taken place since January 20th, 2025 would make even President Nixon recoil. This is your legacy, Attorney General Bondi. In 8 short months, you have fundamentally transformed the Justice Department and left an enormous stain in American history.
The Department of Justice has become the Department of Revenge and Corruption. Rather than pursuing cases without fear or favor, this DOJ seeks to favor the president's friends and instill fear in his alleged enemies. If you're a friend of the president, This corrupt DOJ will bend over backwards to help you.
And Kelly, what did you make of how Attorney General Bondi responded to those criticisms? Is there an erosion of trust in the DOJ? Bigger picture here.
There is such a different view of what is weaponization, and it's really defined by which party these members adhere to, or perhaps the public watching as well. So Republicans were arguing, and so was the Attorney General, that weaponization is over, that was from a past era. But Democrats see a number of things they brought up. The handling of terminations of a number of career officials, prosecutors, FBI agents, and so forth, being fired without cause. They see that as politically motivated. And so there was a lot of tension. It was very partisan. One of the big questions is, did they get at any new answers? And on some of the key issues, I think that remains to be seen.
And before I let you go, there was a lot of discussion today about an FBI investigation called Arctic Frost. Explain to our viewers what that is.
This goes back to the time around January 6th when investigators were looking at how were false electors who might have given President Trump at that time the 2020 election. How did that come about? And so the FBI, through court approval, was able to get phone records of several senators to see who they were calling. Were they talking to the White House? Were they talking to people who were involved in the false elector scheme? Republicans are very upset about this, and we heard calls today for a special prosecutor to investigate.
Before I let you all go, Yamiche, I want to go back to you outside the White House. Have you heard from any White House officials about their response to Attorney General Bondi's testimony today? Were they pleased by her performance?
It's a good question. I haven't heard directly from White House officials about their responses, but what I do know is that the president has been very clear that he's praised Attorney General Pam Bondi on multiple occasions, even when there was a lot of questions about how she was handling the Epstein files and the Epstein case, as well as other things. So I suspect that the White House liked what they saw, especially because essentially Attorney General Pam Bondi dodged a lot of questions, especially when it came to her conversations with President Trump. So I imagine, just based on my reporting in the past, that they will be pleased with what they saw today.
Yamiche, Alcindor, Kelly O'Donnell, Julia Ainsley, thank you all so much for joining me.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.